Good morning. Buenos dias, everyone. My name is Selena Moreno, IDRA President and CEO. Welcome to the IDRA José A. Cárdenas School Finance Fellowship Virtual Symposium. We're so excited to have you here for the next 2 hours. We will start with the IDRA José A. Cárdenas School Finance Fellow, Dr. Cristóbal Rodríguez, who will present his report examining the equity of college readiness across schools in Texas. Then we're going to hear from a powerhouse panel, including some of our good friends. I see Lourdes Flores, who if you don't know, you will know soon, moves mountains and people. And also Representative Mary Gonzalez, who of course is a fierce fighter in the Texas legislature. You'll hear more from our panelists, and they'll be introduced a little bit later. But I want to talk about Dr. Cristóbal Rodríguez. He is our third School Finance Fellow. Just a little bit about our fellowship program. The goal of this program is to engage the nation's most promising researchers, like Dr. Rodríguez, in investigating school finance solutions that secure equity and excellence for all public school students. The José A. Cárdenas School Finance Fellows Program was established in 2013 by IDRA, and it was established to honor the memory of IDRA's founder, Dr. José Ángel Cárdenas. So who is Dr. Cárdenas? Who was he? In 1969, he was appointed superintendent of the Edgewood School District here in San Antonio, thus becoming the very first Latino school superintendent in the city of San Antonio and Bexar County. He played a critical role in the landmark school Supreme Court case that many of you know about. We'll talk about it later today, Rodríguez versus SAISD. And he also established the first district-wide non-Head Start early childhood program for all 3, 4, and 5-year-old children in that district, way before it was cool to do so. I thought it was so fitting last week that the U.S. Secretary of Education, Miguel Cardona, chose Edgewood and right next to the Early Childhood Education Center in Edgewood that was named for Dr. Cardona to visit when he met students. After he was superintendent, Dr. Cárdenas founded IDRA in 1973 to ensure fair school funding and ensure that public school students work to prepare all students go to college, because he knew, and we at IDRA believe today, that there's no excellence if you don't have equity. And similarly, if we just focus exclusively on equity without an equally important underscoring of excellence, we're going to see a future in which school privatization and other efforts are leaving public schools equitably underfunded and academically bankrupt. And so we know that schools must ensure that all students are graduate prepared for college, whether or not they decide to go. And so that's why I'm so excited for y'all to hear today Dr. Rodríguez's research on how calculus access and funding equity limits college readiness. So then we're going to hear from IDRA's own data scientist and demographer extraordinaire, Dr. Bricio Vázquez, who will introduce and moderate a conversation among our panel of experts. And before I introduce you, Cristóbal, I want to briefly thank the members of our Fellowship Advisory Committee who help ensure that we select excellent candidates like you. So first, Dr. Maria Cuca Robledo Montesel, who is IDRA's President Emerita, and she actually founded the Dr. José A. Cárdenas School Finance Fellows Program. Professor Edward Garcia Fierros, who is the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Villanova University. Professor Jaime Chaín, who's the Dean of the College of Applied Arts at Texas State University. Albert Kaufman, Professor Kaufman, who's a professor at St. Mary's Law School and was also the former MALDEF Regional Counsel, whose school funding litigation against the state of Texas just changed the face of Texas education. And of course, Dr. Albert Cortés, who is our very own former IDRA Director of Policy and one of our expert panelists today. who served as expert witness for MALDEF when Al Kaufman was leading it, and more recently, the school finance cases for MALDEF when I was honored to be on the litigation team. Last but not least, I want to introduce to all of you the man of the hour, Dr. Cristóbal Rodríguez. As I said earlier, Dr. Rodríguez is the Associate Dean of Inclusion and Community Engagement and Associate Professor at Arizona State University. But before this, he was an Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Studies and the Director of Graduate Studies in the School of Education at Howard University in Washington, D.C. His research centers on diverse demographics and it explores how policy and leadership influence equity and access for diverse populations throughout the educational pipeline. He received his doctorate in education policy and planning at UT Austin, emphasizing education research, evaluation, and policy analysis with a social and cultural historic focus. And Dr. Rodríguez, we are so honored to have you today, and I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Gracias, Selena, and gracias to all the beautiful and amazing family of IDRA. I was mentioning before we all came on how I've missed our times there. I almost want to keep going back more frequently, especially when they have the amazing potlucks, the comida, the soul food. It's like no other place. So I always, it created a really wonderful space in my heart and soul for the work that you all do, the advocacy you all have. And so it's a place that I think any of us would be blessed to be engaged with at any level, but I definitely feel blessed to be here to have this connection with you all.
Come back and we'll feed you.
Oh, anytime. I'm going to quote you on that. I'm going to show up like on random days too. Like Selena said, I can come back anytime and eat here. But anyway, so I want to get us started here. Oh, I'm hitting the wrong buttons. Here we go. Get us started on our work. Let's see if I can. Okay, I'm unmuted for now. We go. All right. So here we go. Here's the work that we put together. I want to start off by kind of speaking a little bit in terms of recognizing a few folks. I really want to particularly thank the amazing folks at IDRA, the beautiful and amazing staff, particularly Bricio Vasquez, for his invaluable time and feedback. He's an amazing asset in so many levels in the creativity, in the thinking, and the processing of this work. So I'm really deeply appreciative of Bricio for all he brought to the table, and moreover, what he brings to the work as well. Definitely want to acknowledge the contributions as well of the advisory committee. Thank you for your leadership, your vision, and insight. I think this work couldn't have been without that additional perspective and approach. And moreover, it's those histories of service and leadership that you all have provided that really kind of added and contributed to this creativity and this effort. I also want to thank particularly colleague Dr. Raylene Soon out of the University of Texas El Paso, who also provided support for the creativity as well. My colleague here at Arizona State University, Mariana Olivares, and as well as early on the doctoral program candidate from the University of Texas San Antonio, Pisha Mabry, who've all been wonderful to be able to just even process, reflect, and share in the creativity of this process. And the important part of the aspect of all of this is when you do research on any topic, it's important to always kind of go through the process of engaging others. Not only does it stimulate the creativity, but it also supports the collaborations that I think our communities really reflect, and as well advances, right? So I wanted to start with that. You know, the legacy of San Antonio ISD, Rodriguez, is really important. Not only did it give us Jose Cárdenas and the Intercultural Development Research Association, but also when we look at the conversation around even how we've used and acknowledged the 14th Amendment as part of the educational process, that it's clear when it says we shouldn't deny access to equal educational opportunities to students in public schools. Yet when you look at school finance litigation, it's always based on adequacy or sufficiency or efficiency, depending on the state's constitution. And when we think about the legal challenges, it's only kind of addressed whether essentially are we providing enough, right? Is it just enough? But when it comes to now the Every Student Succeeds Act conversation that now kind of at the administrative code level in US code and says that now we are required and pushed to have states address college and career readiness, then it changes the conversation. At least I believe it does. So when you look at school finance and funding conversations and now college readiness, the question becomes, and that's what kind of inspired this conversation, this work, was looking at what's the relationship between school finance policy and how it guides or influences college readiness access. And then the question of, is it fairly accessed? Is there equal educational opportunity for all students to really access college and career readiness? And that kind of then put the conversation forward. And then my kind of interest in working with the civil rights data collection really inspired this conversation as well. And moreover, like in my own kind of history, I was one of those students in Texas education schools that took one of the first series of testing back then it was the TOS test. Some of you might remember that. But the whole idea was, in my own experience, and moreover, how it begins to shape access and overall college and career readiness for our communities. That's where I kind of started to really think about, well, how is the system, right, providing an influence on college readiness for all students? So, that debate is important to think about. It's important to think about the discourse of that. I also think about when we look at the influence that access to highest level math has, we know that today, still the most reported and greatest indicator of completion is algebra middle school and calculus in high school. So we use these indicators as well to give us an idea as to what is not only is achievement, what the achievement looks like, but also what that enrolling, persisting, and graduating from college looks like. So it's a key indicator. And also an important aspect is, if we know we are, as communities of color, extremely underrepresented in the STEM fields, how does that inequity in the system also influence those challenges? So that's even more reason for us to examine this conversation. And while there are definitely research around college readiness and equity, and definitely we look at some of our colleagues who've done college readiness culture research as well. That conversation of actually looking at college readiness and its connection to school finance are hardly out there. At least at the time of this work, I couldn't really find it. So that really gave me kind of inspiration to start pushing the conversation. If it is now essentially both federal and state conversations of college readiness. So how is it equitable? And then how do we examine school finance? Now, college readiness in Texas, those go back to 2005 in a special session that they actually started talking about aligning the curriculum and the instructional requirements to really ensure that we're connecting the dots. So I believe that was a great start for Texas. But at the end of the day, Texas is 40th in sending high school graduates directly to college. Right? Texas is 33rd in enrolling high school students in calculus as well. So it begins to create a question of, all right, to what extent are we really kind of connecting the dots to ensure that we're providing access for all students? And we're our 40th and 33rd, how does that break down across our communities in particular? So making that school finance oriented argument for college readiness provides essentially the best systemic opportunity to meet the goal or mandates of college readiness itself. So here's to start with what the conditions are in Texas. And I wanted to highlight, particularly in this area, this conversation of comparing property poor districts versus property wealthy districts. What does that look like? When you look at the weighted average daily attendance, I'm sorry, I put the dollar signs, I realized that I shouldn't have. But the weighted average daily attendance for property poor district versus a property wealthy district, these are actually numerically as far as 65,000 students and 5,000 students, but essentially you begin to see the differences in tax rates. Right? Essentially, wealthier districts do pay less in taxes. We also see when it comes to wealth per WADA, the difference what that looks like. Even though this district has more students, you're looking at wealth per WADA of 209,000 versus 1.1 million. Right? State tier 1 aid based on student and program funding, what that looks like. Then you look at tier 2, right? This is a conversation for how much funding it's going to receive based on, or how much recaptured funds it's receiving. Obviously, the poor district doesn't provide any recaptured revenue, but this is what it looks like for a properly wealthy district. At the end, when you look at do the math, the idea is that this is what it comes down to: state and local revenue per weighted average daily attendance. Right? They look similar. So the question assumes, and I wanted to point this out, this kind of sense of, well, does a current school finance formula with this assumption that it's providing equal funding, does it actually create equal outcomes? And that's kind of part of the conversation when we analyze the school finance numbers and then tie it to college readiness. Right? When you look at the lowest 20th percentile wealth per WADA tax, they tax a resident essentially at 1.1 per $100 of property value. In contrast, the 80th percentile and above, the wealthier communities, at $1.05 per $100 of property value. So even though it seems like there's a difference of a few cents, you can tell that it really is a big difference in wealth and access. But it's supposed to be somehow equal at some point. So that's the test. So the research question: does district funding influence school calculus enrollment rates in Texas? And how do we kind of examine that? So I used kind of multivariate regression model to be able to play with civil rights data collection, the National Center for Statistics, which allowed us to look at particularly grade level data, and as well as be able to function with data around pre-reduced lunch rates as well. And of course, Texas Education Agency data to be able to look at the school finance information that we played with. At the end, from the numbers that we looked at, it's important to note that about 10% of high school seniors in Texas, at the end of the day, and these are number of districts, we had some districts that were kind of, because of accessible data or not provided data, we had to clean it out, even though there's not 150 districts, there's way more than that. But at the end of the day, based on good data, we ended up with 150 districts. But 10% essentially of high school seniors are enrolled in calculus across Texas. So that's the big number. We also looked at playing with the wealth per WADA, district expenditures per student to kind of get a sense of that, the district property tax rate to see how that influenced the conversation. We also try to plug in first year and second year teacher data, certified teachers, students per counselors. Here's the free reduced lunch rate, and this is all school level data again. Enrollment of Black students, Latino students, white students, and then we also try to play with suspension data that's part of the civil rights data collection. So the descriptive findings, we also wanted to get an idea, well, in this data set, what is the 20th percentile, and I mentioned that earlier, versus the 80th percentile, what does that look like? And off the bat, you look at the 20th percentile wealth per WADA districts, essentially will reflect the 10%, and we know that that's, there's a good number of large districts, period, that are at this level. But you begin to see already the discrepancy when you have wealthier districts that have a higher percentage of students and enrollment rates. One thing to note is there are public school districts that are not, that have schools that are not magnet, that will have 100% of their students. And that's kind of the standard in their districts. One particular district that we looked at in the San Antonio area, Alamo Heights, is one of those districts in schools that has a very high percent of students enrolled in calculus, as well as 8th grade students enrolled in algebra. And that's a public school again, but that's the standard in some districts. So that's a conversation when we look at these double standards almost that are created. Other areas of note is obviously the wealth per WADA differences, the district expenditures should essentially equate similarly back to the formula, the assumption of that. The difference in tax rates, what we're looking at here, obviously poor districts pay more in tax rate. We're looking at similar average teacher, first year and second year teacher rates, almost similar percent of certified teachers. We did find some differences in students per counselor, but I think this has to do with the way funding is situated. Sorry, I went back the wrong way. So there's a slight difference there, but really some of the conversations we looked at, we found that these numbers were not significant, but it did lead us to some suggested areas of interest when we started breaking down the different numbers in different ways. And I'll mention that a little bit later. At the end of the day, when we kind of ran all of this, there was two particular variables that came out significant: the wealth per WADA, and as well as particularly the free reduced lunch rate. And so when you see a positive coefficient, basically says the more wealth per WADA that you have, the more access to calculus enrollment or calculus courses or more enrollment. When you have a negative coefficient, basically tells us when you have more free reduced lunch students, you actually have less enrollment in calculus. That begins kind of this narrative of how we look at this conversation of tying the school finance conversation to, particularly to free reduced lunch students. So here's what it translates to. The first significant variable, the only variable that informs the school funding formula for Texas, is the wealth per WADA with a positive coefficient of 0.02, meaning that while holding all the variables constant in the model, when the wealth per WADA increases by 1 unit, the 12th grade calculus enrollment rate increases by 0.02 units. Unfortunately, while holding variables constant, for every unit increase in essentially free reduced lunch students, there's a decrease in 12th grade calculus enrollment. Right, so that there, interestingly enough, is going to tell us a lot more about how do we then make, what assumptions, or how do we kind of interpret some of this. And this is kind of what I wanted to kind of start thinking through, because it also creates implications for other studies as well. So essentially it tells us, yes, there's a relationship, right? How we then go from here is the question. So when we look at free reduced lunch students and the communities that have less access to calculus courses and essentially have less access to college readiness, even with a recapture school funding formula that equalizes revenue per WADA. So that's essentially the quick and easy, here's what we know now. Now, while essentially the significance is based on other demographic breakdowns we didn't find any, it tells us a little bit more as to there's some areas that we need to definitely start looking to the further deeper analysis, given the segregated nature of Texas high schools, right? It tells us that we need to be able to not access the school level data that I assessed, but if we had student level data, it might be able to give us a better understanding of how essentially the relationship between race / ethnicity and economic status, and what does that look like across communities. So that's going to be an important conversation moving forward. If we had access to an accountability system that specifically examined access to college readiness and did so at the individual level, it'll create an opportunity to be able to really dive deeper into what is that relationship, especially in a segregated state like Texas. So that's another kind of idea to think about. The other area, when you think about previous policies, like 2013, the state legislature essentially weakened school standards, right? And they essentially lessened the number of math courses that was required for high school graduations. And those enrollment rates dropped, obviously, because of the change in the requirements. What it also did is create double standards, right? That on one hand, that even though Texas boasts about its economic power and its investment in economic development, but it doesn't do so in creating or ensuring that there's these higher standards for math and science, technology, engineering. And so when you have this kind of weakened standards, it really does create a double standards when you start seeing there are more affluent, wealthy districts who are providing that access. Right? So it's an important conversation to kind of also see it that without that guideline, even at the standards level, that essentially it's setting up communities to fail, at least in my perspective. Even though the analysis found affluent open access public schools, back to the conversation, like that's kind of be the conversation is how do we transform that reality? I wanted to highlight, and I put a lot of text here because I think as I was going through this, I was like, this really statement allows me to think differently about how we move forward. And so I kind of I said, okay, I know it's a lot of text. We're not supposed to put so much text on presentations like this, but I figured I should give it a shot. But essentially, the current equalizing school funding formula in Texas seems to not have an equalizing effect on college readiness and math. More directly, If an equality or 14th Amendment consideration is made to invest on schools in a manner that makes college readiness and math equitable across Texas schools, there needs to be a formula that enhances specifically, right, directly, college readiness for poverty poor districts and districts with greater economically disadvantaged or free reduced lunch student enrollment, which is central to the current federal mandate under ESSA. The current system maintains essentially privilege for some and sustains inequality for others. As long as we don't have in the formula a conversation how it's directly guiding, enhancing college readiness, then you're going to continue to see this huge inequity, right? Lastly, through the process of data and analytical explorations, there are indications of some highly segregated school districts with high tax rates and low wealth per WADA levels particularly along the US-Texas border, that are indeed making strong investments in college readiness efforts. That particular point was important because we do see cases within El Paso, down in South Texas and McAllen, that those districts are really investing and have the leadership and are showing the success. There are cases there, right? But at what cost, right? They're having high taxes than what everybody else is paying in more affluent communities. And we know leadership matters and it's critical. But at the end of the day, like, it shouldn't take that exceptional cases. It should be the norm, it should be the standard, right? And so to not have it in the formula, and to not guide that kind of almost, if you will, regulate rather, to how we're guiding college readiness to be fairly accessible for everybody, you're going to continue to have unequal access overall. So that investment really is something that I think Texas is to truly invest in the future of all of its students. It should be part of the school funding formula, period. Now, the implications for how we move forward, I think it's something for us to think about. State and federal school finance reform should include additional funding lines, as I said earlier, particularly aligned to increasing college readiness courses. There used to be similar study at the level, not only at the school level funding in relation to college readiness, but particularly as it connects to teacher inequities, class sizes, general education revenues, and school that a school district receives. And if we can break that down in relation to an accountability system that can allow us to take it down to the individual level, I think we'd be in a powerful position to really make some transformational changes in the system. I think there should be conversations beyond adequacy, right? Especially considering the 14th Amendment in Federal Administrative Code that now includes college readiness mandates. Beside, perhaps Al Kaufman could give us an idea of what that could look like, given his expertise. And I surely would like to hear his thoughts on that. But also in the accountability policies that reflect increasing college readiness course enrollment, particularly for economically disadvantaged students and other underserved students. That should be highlighted more and more in some of the reports that we receive, and not just provided on the side, right? That should be part of the people being held accountable to do at the district level and at the state level. I think obviously returning to 4 years of high-level math coursework should be at least be put back on the table. And then back to the idea of Tier 2 recaptured funds should be directly aligned to college readiness indicators. So that how we move forward, and I didn't really highlight implications for other study other than really being able to access individual level data. But one of the conversations is, what does this look like in relation to bilingual ed students, right? To dual language learners particularly. What does this look like for special education or other groups? And we began to dissect the relationship to school funding and then breaking it down in various areas. So those are the kind of implications of also being able to examine to a greater degree we had at the individual level to see how do we transform this conversation so that it's truly fairly accessible for all students. So that in a nutshell is the conversation on what we did. And so I do want to again thank my colleagues who've all been part of the creativity. I'm always happy to serve, and feel free to contact me at any time. And I'll hand it back to Mauricio and our panelists to get their thoughts.
Thank you very much, Cristóbal, for your presentation, the work that you've done as a José Ángel Cárdenas School Fellow. I will now, we're now moving over to the next segment of this webinar, and I'll briefly cover what we're going to do. My name is Dr. Bricio Vasquez. I'm IDRA's data scientist and demographer. I've been with IDRA now for a little over 3 years, and it's been one of the projects that I've been involved with have been some of the most interesting, compelling that I've had. This is one of those efforts that I believe has great importance for Texas and for our broader educational system. So what we're going to do now is we have 3 panelists that are joining us to comment on general school finance issues and on the findings of this report. We will allow them to introduce themselves, and after their introductions, we have a set of questions to guide the discussion. Each question will be directed towards a specific panelist, and after they answer, other panelists may comment on that question afterwards. After the panel discussion, then we will open it up to the audience for comments or questions, both on the information that the panelists provided to us and also on Cristobal's report. Before we move to our introductions, I do want to thank Dr. Chloe Sykes, Hector Bojorquez, and Christy our communications director of communications at IDRA. These folks contributed to the planning and communications of this webinar. So thank you all for your contributions. So our panelists that we selected range from different areas of expertise. Our first panelist, Dr. Mary Gonzalez, is a state representative. She will be commenting on some of the questions that we have. We also have Dr. Albert Cortez, who is former IDRA's Director of Policy. And then we also have Ms. Lourdes Flores, who is the Executive Director of Arise, an organization down in the Rio Grande Valley. And so I will start, if we can start with Dr. Mary Gonzalez, if you want to introduce yourself and say a few words, and then we'll move on to Albert and then Ms. Lourdes Flores. Dr. Gonzalez, please.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Vasquez. And Cristóbal, it's so great to hear you and all of your fascinating research. I'm excited to be here with the IDRA family. Really, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mary Gonzalez. I represent the eastern part of El Paso County. I have been doing that for the last 10 years. And I also serve on the Public Education Committee and Vice Chair of the Appropriations Committee. I also professionally work for the National Public Education Support Fund, where I'm the Associate Director for the Partnership for the Future of Learning, and just really have been working in great partnership with IDRA, not only in Texas, but really in the whole South region, thinking through how we create greater equity for all students. And so I think I'm excited to have a conversation about Dr. Rodriguez's research, because it is so fascinating from the viewpoint of both a policymaker and somebody who's involved in advocacy organizations for equity. I think that there has lots of potential for future conversations, and so eager to visit with all of y'all today.
And being from El Paso, it's an extra added super bonus, the jewel of what I call the jewel of the West. So
thank you.
Gracias, Mary.
Yes, they're good to see you.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Dr. Cortez?
Yes, again, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Albert Cortez. I was formerly Director of Policy for IDRA, where I worked from 1975 until I retired in January of 2016. During that time, I spent about 35 of those years working extensively on creating greater equity in the school funding system, as noted, testified in just about all of the Edgewood school finance equity cases, working very closely with Al Kaufman, David Hinojosa from MALDEF on those cases. But my biggest claim to fame probably is that I had the honor of being mentored by Dr. Jose Cárdenas on school finance equity issues for about 20 years while he was still at the organization. And during that time, I learned the intricacies of the Texas school finance system. I think sometimes I believe it was purposefully designed to be totally unexplainable or not understandable to a lot of people because it makes it easy then for those that know the system well to manipulate it to their advantage. Fortunately, a lot of folks on our side learned to understand the system and were thereafter able to effectively participate in the efforts that eventually dragged the Texas legislature into creating a more equitable funding system. But it took over 25 years of litigation. And sorry to say that even though the system is more equitable, we have not arrived there yet, as was noted in Cristobal's research. Lisa, do you want us to comment on some of the research pieces now or do the intros first?
We'll do the intros first, and I have a specific set of questions for each of you.
Sure.
Thank you, Albert. Ms. Lourdes Flores, please.
Sí, muy buenos días. Good morning. And thank you for having me here. My name is Lourdes Flores. I'm a director at Arise, a community development program that has been serving the colonias here in South Texas for almost 33 years. And I'm also a parent that, I have 3 teenagers. I think one of our biggest work in Arise has been the work with the parents, the empowerment, the leadership that we provide to our parents to be able to accomplish or to be able to support them in the dream that we all as immigrant families have, and that is to provide a better future for our children. So I think that I have worked with Arise and has given us the opportunity to work all these 33 years in Arise and to promote and to encourage the leadership, the empowerment, and also the collaboration with other agencies such as IDRA, who is very important in assuring that this type of work in the schools, in the children's education gets more profundo, more profound, and more meaningful. So thank you for inviting me here again.
Thank you, Lourdes, for being here. So we'll start off with Dr. Gonzalez. And again, after Dr. Gonzalez provides a response, the panelists, including Cristóbal, feel free to comment on the question. So Dr. Gonzalez, in your work with the state legislature and your committees, we're wondering, how does this work, this research by Cristóbal, inform state goals for articulating K-12 to higher education?
I really appreciate this question because I think it's very timely. As everybody knows, and as Dr. Cortez mentioned, we have done a lot for school finance, but have a long ways to go still. But I think is really up to the legislature. The next step is, after we pass HB3, the large school finance bill, the question a lot of legislators have is, well, what does school finance reform or differences look like next? And I think this really adds to the equation what it could potentially look like, while broadening how we think about what we should be funding, how we should be funding things, and what it means to equity, and what it means to long-term completing our 60 by 30 goals. So, for example, I really appreciated that Dr. Rodriguez talked about how it should be not just like an added on because the school district has decided they're going to do these extra initiatives, but it should be woven into the cultural tapestry of our public school system as a whole. And by doing that, it'll create greater access to equity. I'm not sure that a lot of legislators know it or think of it or conceptualize it in that way. And so through the research, we can now create talking points to advance changes in the school finance formula, which I think this is a moment to do that, because it's been 2 sessions since now HB3, or 1 session, and it'll be the second one, and there'll be some energy to make some changes.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Will some of the other panelists care to comment on that question?
Mary, I agree that House Bill 3 did make some improvements to the funding system. In my analysis of the data that was generated on the impact, it did appear that what the legislature wound up doing is moving money around. So by eliminating the cost of education index, it freed up over $1 billion that was, I think, well targeted to programs like economically disadvantaged students, a minor increase in bilingual education program funding. And while I would agree with many that House Bill 3 was a step forward in improving funding levels, I think you'd agree that while the first step, there's a lot more to be done in really making the system all that it can be in terms of both equity and excellence.
Oh, completely. I don't think HB3 really did enough to address equity, and that was my biggest concern. And as we continue to work through school finance centering equity, this is a really important part of the conversation that has traditionally not been part of the conversation. I think when we think about equity, a lot of times we can only, sometimes it gets really siloed into thinking about weights only, and this creates another lens of which to think about equity.
Thank you. I agree.
Other comments?
And adding to that, I think we're pushing the narrative in the conversation of college readiness, right? The discourse has been, is it providing enough? Are we, and that adequacy conversation, we can push it a little bit further and actually saying, look, if we do require and expect college readiness to be part of the central conversation, right? To shift the conversation away from adequacy or sufficiency, those conversations I think are critical when it comes to ensuring that we don't create double standards, right? So if House Bill 3, I know that there were some conversations to have, particularly for dual language learners, which I think was a great step in the right direction. I think there's an additional open opportunity to take it a little bit further and say, okay, not just for groups, but also we start thinking college readiness for groups as well. I think that allows us to say, we're to invest in the future of Texas. I think that's the next step, right?
Responding to that, Cristóbal, my long history of working with the legislature and with Texas school districts all over the state is that if you want some new initiatives to take place, it's always important first to create policy that encourages them to do that. But as importantly, it's to provide the resources to enable the school districts to implement those innovations that you want. So if we want to incorporate the concept of college readiness into the funding conversation, we have to get specific about what components of the system and what policies need to be created that will support moving more students toward college readiness. So my sense is if we said that districts would get extra funding if they got more kids taking advanced math, you would automatically get more students taking advanced math.
Yeah, it seems like a clear 1 + 1 = 2 conversation. Right? At least we hope so. But obviously, Mary could tell you that the politics don't play out that easily, right?
Politics.
Well, and I will say about the politics, this is perfect timing, right? So what do we know? We just finished redistricting. We know that the chair of public ed just decided he's not running for office. There'll be a whole new wave of legislators, a whole new leadership. And so planting the seed in this moment in time is really critical. And I love what Lourdes said. You know, it's about having it be a profound system, right? A profound educational opportunity. And I think that's really what we're speaking to right now.
Very good.
I wanted to hear your thoughts. One of the things that I referenced were communities down in South Texas and the borderlands that are making the investment on their own, whether it's through their, taxing at the highest rate, but also having the leadership, and in your case, the community engagement. And that's a lot of investment and time and sacrificio from familias, but it's happening. We know that. But those are the exceptions. It's not the rule, and it's not what happens in most communities. But I kind of want to hear, in you reflecting about the sacrificio and the leadership that is being made in communities like yours, what does that mean to ensuring that it's not just because it's not just an exceptional case, but rather, how do we ensure that you do have the support, if we're talking about school finance, to ensure that this is a case for all children across Texas? Right?
I think that, in all cases, it's very important to be able to have the voices, the different voices that can support and can help with bringing forward new initiatives, bringing forward new legislation, new proposed laws. I think it's important to bring the people's voices, the students' voices, the parents' voices that are part of that, because we have the energy, the interest in getting involved, but that doesn't always work in all cases, but it takes one person to ask a question, or it takes one small group of parents to be involved, so that then others can come along and continue to be engaged and be sharing, and because at the end, all the work that is being done is for the mejoría, for the support of the students. So I think that, when you mentioned that it takes new initiatives, or it takes creative initiatives also, it takes the parents also to be able to support and to provide that kind of feedback. Sometimes it's unfortunate that in many places, as you're mentioning, as here in South Texas, it's an exception, but it takes small one step or one person to be able to involve other parents. Many times we have seen is when, especially for the experience of Arise, when we go into a new community, all it takes is a door knock, and then people come in, open the doors, and they invite us, because they're hungry to be able to be engaged and to be heard. So I think it's important that as parents, that we give opportunity for others parents to come along, but also as leaders of community or leaders at the school levels or different entities, that we do open up the doors for those parents to be engaged.
I love what Lourdes said. I think it's very powerful. Cristóbal, so I'm really excited about what I heard. And so I text the Commissioner of Higher Education. I'm like, we need to have a meeting so we could talk about this. And his first question was, well, how are they defining college readiness, right? And he posed a couple of questions following from that. But what Lourdes is alluding to is how do we define college readiness? And if we're defining it with the lens of equity, that has to include families, because families are key to readiness and resilience in college, right? And so I really like thinking again, if we're centering equity, what does that mean for specifically communities of color? And that has to include a family curriculum and family outreach, or else it's just not going to land where we want it to land.
Well, and I think added to that point, if families are engaged in the accountability conversation to be able to say, here's the data, here's what we're seeing in our communities, and if we think about the history of accountability to say, we are holding the system, we are holding districts accountable to ensuring they respond to the inequities or to ensure that all children have access, fair access to college readiness, right? And so if we hooked it also from an accountability perspective, I think it creates an opportunity to advocate to greater degrees, right? Like we know that there's great information, like the information I accessed is all publicly accessible, but it doesn't translate or it doesn't transfer real easily so that then a Lourdes can be now an advocate in the system of not only having these conversations either at the school or district level, but also at the state level, right? So I think that parent engagement is key. We also think of it from that advocacy approach as well.
On your point about accountability being an important component of what can drive the system, I think it's worth noting that college readiness really isn't a measure of accountability in the Texas system. You know, we may track it, we may gather data on it, but we don't expect districts to meet any particular targets on the percentage of students that are considered college readiness, and further track that to see how many of their students actually enroll in college and that it's reported back to the community. I know that there are data sets out there that collect the information, Mary, but all too often it doesn't get back to the consumers at the local level that have the highest stakes in the system. So that if we made, just as a subset of college readiness, the percentage of students taking 4 years of English, 4 years of math, 4 years of science, 4 years of social studies, which was the old 4x4 curriculum that tried to ensure that as many students as possible were college ready. If we had indicators of how many districts were able to meet targets set in those areas, I think you might see some movement in helping guide the legislature, particularly in those areas where school districts might be falling short, and identifying what might be needed to help them reach those targets.
Albert, as you were saying that, and this conversation of providing that information so that it becomes a point in accountability to change systems, it made me think of being in middle school in El Paso, and in 7th grade, there was a student, Maribel, who I'll never forget, who actually asked, which also speaks of like where I was at the time, asked, interestingly enough, the math teacher why she didn't get chosen to go to 8th grade algebra. And she also asked, like, why was I selected? Interestingly enough. So I think about that story and that narrative because I thought I would have said, I agree. She was a lot smarter than I was. But that moment in 8th grade algebra almost detract her from being able to go on to having access to a limited number of spaces and seats and courses in high school. And she went off to the Navy, right? And not to say that was a bad choice, but I knew that it was a conversation of access and there was only so many seats. And I would have said, I'm with her. Let's throw her in 8th grade algebra instead of me. But for some reason, the math teacher defended it. But it was, again, a small limit. And the same thing happens in high school conversations with students. Who gets tracked down, who doesn't. And if we're not increasing that access, then we're always going to limit a small percent of students who are going to be tracked on, whose conversations about going to college and particularly certain careers are going to miss out on that access.
And that ties back into how much funding is provided to schools and whether it provides all the resources that are needed for students to give all of their students the best opportunities that might be available to them. So we get back again to the school funding level in terms of excellence issues and the school funding equity issue. And because we find that students in Texas are still underfunded, when I looked at the most recent data for 2021, we find that local school districts, and the state share the cost of education, and that's an equalizing feature in the system and a positive thing. But right now, the state is only picking up 47% of the cost of the basic program of tier 1 and 2, and that means that local school districts are picking up 53%, which is the majority of the cost. So, Mary, as you all engage, and I know you're in the Appropriations Committee now, the fact that the state is still not carrying the majority of the cost of education funding overall suggests to me that there is room for the legislature to increase state investment in the K-12 educational system so that we can ensure that more students have more opportunities, including opportunities to take more math and science courses than is currently available. And to understand that the reason that many districts may not offer all the programs and coursework that might be needed is they don't have the funding to provide it. So if they don't have enough money to provide, incentive funding to get more math teachers and more science teachers because they don't get enough money to fund the system, then they're having to make hard choices about who to exclude. Getting back to your point, Cristóbal, that then some students get excluded from equitable and excellent opportunities because of the limited resources that are made available by the state to local school districts.
Well, and what I appreciate about Cristóbal's story, and it kind of blends both points, is that yes, we should be funding this. Yes, it needs to be part of the larger conversation. But if we're going to fund it, we also have to be cognizant of how we do the work with incorporating the realities of race and gender, class and ability status, or else, again, it could in fact not do the intended goal of creating more equity if we don't apply that lens. So thinking through Cristóbal's story, because when I heard that story, I'm like, well, maybe because there was a gender component to that, right? And so how do we make sure that as we add these initiatives, we're thinking through incorporating all the necessary lenses from an intersectional way?
That's a really good point. I agree with you.
Another part I think that it's important as parents and in ARISE that we also look into is that to make sure that it's not a component of what is it, like of Colonia students in our case. For example, we've heard stories of families that of parents that they said that they've been told, their students have been told, you don't need this math, you don't need this algebra, because people or students from colonias are not gonna, more than likely will not go into college. So as parents, if we hear that message, or as parents, if we hear that our students being told, you don't need algebra, or you don't need this algebra too, that we understand enough to be able to advocate and say, no, wait a minute, he does need it. And so that then they don't lose out on that opportunity for the different reasons that are happening, but that we be able to, as parents, advocate, and as parents understand that they do need that algebra. So what is happening is it because of the financial inequality, or que no hay suficiente financiamiento, there's not enough financing, then we as parents need to advocate for that. But then to be, to understand and not just take that, then he doesn't need algebra, or she doesn't need algebra, she doesn't need that math. But we, as parents, understand that, and we hear that message, say, wait a minute, she does, or he does. What can I do to be able to help my daughter make sure that they are in that course?
Lourdes, if I may just jump in here for a second, I like that you address the issue of specifically how the lack of college college algebra and advanced mathematics, what that looks like, right, for parents and students. And understand that you had your own sort of personal journey in getting your kids into advanced level math and other college ready courses, college readiness types of courses that would prepare your children for college. Can you talk a little bit about what that looked like and some of the challenges that you faced in advocating for your kids?
Well, yes, I think that our role as advocates or as RISE leaders, when we hear stories, and we've been serving our community for many years already, and when at the beginning when we would hear stories about our parents, just like this one that I was mentioning, where a student was told that he or she did not need algebra to be able to graduate. Or when we would hear stories of this student, I was told that people from colonias really usually don't go to college, or those type of stories, or that just focus on this type of a course because usually our immigrants or Hispanic community are more good with are better with their hands-on hands crafts or skills or this type of work that they do well and they do better. And so we as a RISE became very aware and very concerned with this type of messages that were being given to our students, especially when at the other hand we were listening from parents, I want my kid to go to college, I came here and I'm sacrificing to come across so that my child can have a better education and move and graduate because me as parent, I was not able to attend college. So when we were hearing those type of messages, we felt that it was important to be able to inform, to provide leadership, to provide empowerment for our parents, and encourage them and to teach this community or this group to be able to understand graduation requirements, to be able to understand college readiness, to be able to understand financial aid, those type of things that are important to make sure that they would then assure that and see where the kid was and then be able to have to succeed and be able to finish high school and then move forward to college. So we started providing that type of information on those type of sessions, workshops, and then and we realized that we became sort of a bridge between the parents, the families, and the schools, college or the high schools, to be able to connect those parents and have them understand the process that they needed to be able to help their kids. It was difficult, many times because as parents, we always felt like, well, the school knows better, or I didn't go to college, or I barely finished third grade, or things like that. Like there's always that type of worried or concern as a parent. How can I teach, or how can I make sure that my kid goes to college? But then it was more of understanding the process and have them understand also, like, they didn't have to understand how algebra works or they didn't have to solve a problem of algebra or calculus. What they needed to know is that it was important that their school or that their student or their child, that their child had those type of courses, that their child in their report cards or in their class or in freshman year or in sophomore or in their high school years, that their kids was receiving 4 years of math, that their kids was receiving 4 years of English and science and things like that. So that was important. That was the important part for them to understand that than for them to learn how to work an algebra problem. That they could seek the support with the school. They knew if they knew how to do it, then they could seek that support for their students. So, when we started learning about that and we started being involved or engaged in the school and wanted to hear or talk to the different school districts, or whether it was the whole district or a particular school, pues we were being seen as, at the beginning, we were being seen more as volunteers or support people that they could come and do this type of work. But we were more interested in understanding more deeper about how I can, as a parent, how I can be engaged and how I can be of support for the school, and how I can be of support so that, again, make sure that my kid was ready for college at the end of the high school year. So there has been a lot of involvement of parents, a lot of support. We have great leaders at Arise that have been able to accomplish and meet with school board and meet with different entities in favor or in support of the parent leadership and also the student success. So again, the type of workshops and the type of training that we provide for our parents are these type of things of the requirements, the different type of endorsements when they came along, and making sure that their kids had all their other what is it called, the classes that they needed in English and again in science, in math. I think that also the connection in the follow-up or the continuity in once the school is the high school or the student graduates is like that transition from high school to college. Also, especially at the beginning, continue to be there as parents, because we gotta be able to support our kids as they're continuing, as they're moving forward with college. Pero pues we do that as parents, and also that transition, from high school to high school, from middle school to high school, and then so on and so forth. I think that the parents have a lot of encouragement or animals to be able to continue to be engaged, not just for their own kids, but for, especially when there's a big group, for the whole the whole community, a larger community of students.
So I'm going to go a little bit off script here, and just following up on some of your comments, Lourdes, regarding knowledge about college readiness. What is college readiness? What is a higher level math? How does that compare? What are the courses that a child needs to take in order to be prepared to meet the challenges of a college education? And so I think one of the important elements of that is also high school counselors. And I'm tying that to Cristobal's report. You did include, Cristobal, a table that had the differences in college counselors per student, the number of students per counselor at the two different types of schools, right? Property wealthy schools versus property poor schools. And as you know, property poor schools counselors have a much higher caseload of students per each counselor than the property wealthy schools. And this is a question to the panel in general. I know that the report focused on math, on calculus, but what role does school finance play in making counselors more accessible to students?
Let me jump in on that one. Cristobal made the point that there were differential ratios in counselors to students in high wealth and low wealth districts. historically, that's been the case. I don't think it's really been improved much. And it's confounded by the fact that even if you have somewhat lower pupil to counselor ratios, if counselors are not supported and directed in providing college going support to students and are diverted to, providing multiple kinds of support, including social service and other things that are important, then simply just having more counselors without some targeted, specialized subcomponents of counseling being emphasized within legislation, in this case, will help address having more counselors is important, but again, making sure that that a sufficient percentage of their time is allocated to academic counseling of students in order to help them frame the most possible, the best future that might be before them. But related to that point about funding and counselors is that there's a systemic element that's incorporated into the overall education system right now. And Lourdes mentioned the endorsement tracking system that was put in place when they got rid of the 4x4 curriculum that was amended by HB 5. And Mary, I think you were there during those sessions. And the debate was made very clearly that if we no longer required students to take certain courses, that it was going to create a system where disproportionate numbers of minority and low-income students were going to be tracked into non-college endorsement. And I know IDRA did some research, and Cristóbal, I know you noted it, that right after the adoption of those endorsement tracking programs, that the number of students that were enrolling in higher level mathematics went down by 25%. So if we want a deeper understanding of why more of our students may not be enrolling in higher math courses, all you have to do is take a look at the endorsement tracking program that was created by HB 5. And I know that some people will say, well, that was unintended consequences. Well, if they were unintended, I think there are opportunities to fix it, both by increasing the counseling support that's provided, by again increasing funding that takes wealth and concentration of high need students into consideration, but also relooking at that whole endorsement tracking system, doing some research on what proportions of students are going into the different tracks within school districts and seeing if that part of the system needs to be modified.
That's an extremely important point. I wanted to highlight some dimensions of this that we didn't get to talk about, or that I didn't really do the analysis, but I saw it come up as we were doing different exploratory analysis. And it connects back to Lourdes's points about being able to understand what do the numbers look like and the accessibility when you have these conversations with parents, and what parents then take back to districts, and being able to advocate to increase enrollment or access, right? And so let me share this and I see this a lot in larger districts. So it's important to look at the within district segregation that does happen. One of the areas that I look at, just to highlight this point, here's a district, and this is here in Arizona. This is Mesa Unified School District. It's the largest district in Arizona. Well, here's this district that is almost just as equally Latino and white, 43%, 43, 44%. But when you look at how access from preschool, gifted and talented, algebra 8th grade, and even calculus does not reflect the district demographics. It's more white in calculus, almost 2/3 white. But then also the within school district segregation, here are the Latino high schools. They're all about the same size. And this happens in Texas and almost anywhere throughout the US. And as I looked at these numbers, all these high schools are about 3,300 to 3,600 students in size. That this school here that is 54% Latino only offers one calculus class, 16 students, or Mesa High School that only it has almost more than 2/3 Latino students, only offers 2, versus white high schools offers 5 calculus courses or 4 calculus courses. So we don't address this conversation at the school level, right? And have these conversations across districts so that they're looking and comparing these numbers, then you'll see who gets essentially more access based on their school's demographics. And that double standard should not be the case, right? There should be a lot more access. And so when you look at most districts in state, it's only offering 1 or 2 calculus classes based on their schedule. And that's what they always will have year after year. And it has to look different, right? So it's something for us to think about then as we engage communities and families to say, hey, if Alamo Heights can have almost 100% of their students in their public school in calculus or in 8th grade algebra, why can't we? Why shouldn't we, right? And then if we look at even these larger districts across Texas, how does it look within the districts and how do we address that point? And then making sure that parents are part of the conversation. And I think that's critical. We had one district that had a almost 5,000 student high school in Virginia, 20% Latino students, and not a single Latino student in calculus. Not a single one. And to me, it was like, if I were a parent, the very first thing is we're having a conversation with the principal and we'll take it up higher as high as we can take it. And I see that in more integrated districts that have a no majority population, they have a significant white, Latino, or Black population, Latino students are not getting enrolled in college-ready courses at the lowest rates in some cases. So these conversations are really critical to then be able to advocate to make these changes as well.
Patricia, I saw Representative Gonzalez was going to comment on the endorsement issues and tracking.
Well, I mean, I could comment on that all day long, but what I did want to really uplift is, I think one of the struggles that we have in Texas is that we're giants. 30 million people, 5.5 million kids in our public school system. So we're talking about formulas, we're talking about accountability, we're talking about what's needed. It's really difficult because so many areas need so many different things. So when we're talking about, for example, counselors, when I think about my border community of El Paso, right after the shooting, gosh, we needed the ratio of counselors. What we really needed was really different because of what was happening in our community. And so what we're really speaking to is not only the need for there to be that standardized and institutionalized funding, right? Because that allows for there to be, again, woven into the culture, but the space for a culturally relevant application of that funding for it to make sense, right? Because what is needed, and you were speaking a little bit to this, in your example, in some larger ISDs may not be needed at some smaller ISDs or vice versa. And so everything is just so relative to location, history, culture, all these dynamics. And so, for example, if a school on the border has been doing some of this work, maybe they need something different, right? And so what does that look like? And so all these elements, and it just becomes complicated in a state like Texas because we're so big. And so as we advocate for these policies, and it's difficult because we want to create the flexibility, but we want to hold people accountable to use the funds in the ways they need to use the funds for our communities. So how do you create the both and? And so looking forward to figuring out that needle and thread together.
I'd suggest, Representative Gonzalez, that the complexity that was built into the CompEd formula where there are multiple factors and 5 levels of funding to take care of different types of school districts with different concentrations, a similar kind of multifaceted formula for funding counselors that incorporates a significant one to ensure that counselors provide academic counseling to students to help them take all the courses required for college could be developed. I agree with you that it's a complex state with complex issues, but Texas has demonstrated for the rest of the country more than once that we have the capability to develop those complex formulas. And I'm sure that Dr. Cristóbal and others might volunteer to help frame that kind of formula.
Oh, and I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, right? I'm just advancing that as we go down this pathway to advocate, making sure that's part of the conversation because of it can get left out in the Texas legislature because of the lack of diversity that exists in leadership positions and a not understanding of the need for a culturally relevant application of even when they think of college readiness. They may not apply those two things.
Yeah, and I appreciate the fact that you bring all of that depth and perspective when you engage in those conversations.
Well, thank you.
So I appreciate your comment, Dr. Gonzalez, about the size of Texas. And I do want, I know we have you until 11:30, so I do want to ask this question. And again, this is a bit off script, right? But it does address something that you talked about, right? In Texas, at least for the past 20 years, we've been talking about, demographers have been talking about how Texas is going to become a majority minority state. And that has happened and has been the case for a number of years. Specifically, in K-12, Latinx students make up the majority of all public enrollment in the state. In addition, we also have differences in college enrollment rates by race and ethnicity. And I'm pointing to the infographic that our communications director, Christy Goodman, posted in the chat that says that Latinx students have the lowest college enrollment rates in the state of Texas. So if we tie that again to Texas 60 by 30, it sounds to me that there needs to be some pretty substantial and, dare I say, right, revolutionary changes in the structure of how we make college more accessible to Latinx students and other students of color in the state. Would you care to comment or expand on some of these facts?
Sure. No, I mean, really, there's so much there, right? Like, I don't even know where to start. But what I will say is, when we're talking about the transformative change that's necessary to both address what's needed at the K through 12 level and the higher ed level, because these two things work in conjunction. So you can do college readiness, but if you don't make college affordable, if you don't do all the other shifts in higher ed, then there's still a gap, right? And we're never going to achieve the goals. And I think what has happened for a lot of decades is the lack of conversations between these two spaces, the leadership of these two spaces. Now, luckily, I think there is some desired efforts for the agencies to come together. The leadership conversation is shifting to maybe think a little bit more about pathways intentionally, strategically, and how do we make sure that students of color are on those pathways. But before I do a little bit of talks about this because it's based on my academic research. The silos that exist between K through 12 and higher ed have definite implications specifically for students of color. Because again, you can't fix one without thinking of the other, or else the pipeline's never going to be actualized. And so what I think would be great for us, and this is another conversation for us to even think broadly if we want to start thinking about school finance, is there isn't weighted systems in the higher ed formulas, right? So there is no incentive for higher ed institutions there is some, but they're really, there's not a school, yeah, there's not a funding formula incentive to not only incentivize, but also to support the needs for students of color. And so, again, thinking about these things holistically is really critical.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez.
And I will say one last thing because I have to go. Dr. Rodríguez, I really want to say thank you for your leadership and your research. Lourdes, thank you for your advocacy. I represent 260 colonias in my district. So I just am always grateful for families who are just advocating so fiercely. And, you know, Dr. Cortés, you're just a legend to so many of us. And so to all the IDRA team, just love you all so much. And so if you all need anything, I'm here. We just ended session 2 days ago and I still haven't slept. So, but I want to say I'm still always here and thank you and grateful for to be in community with y'all.
Gracias, Mary, for all that you do, Doctora Gonzalez, and abrazo fuerte. Keep repping hard. El Paso and Chuco, the jewel of the West, our heart is always going to be there. But thank you for all that you do. Appreciate it.
Thank you all. Have a
Happy
great
to serve. Let us know.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. The next question is actually for you, Albert, and others, of course, make comments. But if we can, let's get into the nitty-gritty of school finance. So IDRA, as you know, is continuing the legacy that José Ángel Cárdenas started with school finance. Not only are we do we administer the School Finance Fellows program, but we work with you very closely, Dr. Cortés, and another of our staff member, Dr. Chloe Sykes, is also part of a team that is building a Texas school finance model. And so even though we're working diligently to make progress on this model, I think there's still some fogginess, at least with the general community, about where precisely we find these inequities. And Cristóbal addressed some of these, right? The major one is that property poor communities tend to have a higher tax burden. But when we look at at the funding per student, it looks equal, but there are sort of inequities that occur within, that are hidden, dug deep within the school finance formulas. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those inequities are manifested, not only in the school finance formulas, but also when the rubber meets the road, right? Like how do those inequities translate into specific funding for schools and districts?
Sure. And Lourdes, it was good to see you again. I don't think I've seen you in about 5 or 6 years. And I remember conversations as we talked about House Bill 5 and the endorsement issue and what we needed to do in order to make sure that our kids didn't get tracked into non-college routes. And I'm very happy to see that you all have really taken off on that issue and are providing critical support. We always felt that families were essential to the conversation. And if they weren't around the table, we might as well not have them. So I appreciate, you're joining the conversation. On the deep diving on the why we have inequities in the Texas school finance system, part of the basic answer is we don't provide enough equalized funding across the system to make sure that for every penny of tax effort, every school district winds up getting the same amount of money. We've actually created a complicated system where there is 3 major components. The largest one is called the foundation or tier 1 component. That accounts for about 80% of the funding and guarantees that every district gets about $65 for every penny of effort, or about $6,100 for about 92 cents of tax effort. And that is fairly equalized. If you tax yourself at a 92-cent rate, most school districts will wind up with about $6,160 for every student in the regular program. But then there are other components that are not funded at that same high level in tier 2, which is considered the enrichment tier level. There's a 2A and a 2B, and 2A is referred to as golden pennies because they give you $98 for every penny of tax effort. And then on the copper pennies, you only get about $45 for every penny of tax effort. So even within the funding system, there are different levels of return for tax effort, depending on which part of the system you're looking at. And you can buy a lot more for $98 per penny than you can for $35 per penny. So the inconsistencies in the amount of money that you get for the same penny of tax effort is one of the flaws in the system. And experts have argued for a long time that the way to fix that is to have just one block system where for every penny of tax effort, you get the same return for every district, regardless of the wealth of the school district. So if a school district for a penny can only raise $3,000, but the state expects you and wants you to have $6,000, they provide the extra money. And if a rich district raises $5,000, they only get $1,000 to bring them up to the same level. So that's one of the flaws in the system, that there currently isn't equal return for every penny of tax effort. And so the system essentially winds up being underfunded because there are some of the tiers that don't give you as much money as the components that give you more money. So that's one of the flaws. I know that, Cristóbal, you mentioned recapture as one of the positive features that helps equalize the system. And that brings in about $2 billion, $2.3 billion per year that the state puts back into education in the form of kind of general revenue that goes back as through the equalized system. So it is taking money from wealthy school districts that generate extra funds and puts it back into the system and distributes it in an equalized manner. I think in your paper, you suggested perhaps looking at recapture and using that in a more targeted way. And possibly, since it is coming from the local school districts and it's supposed to help equalize the system, that maybe what we can do with that recapture component is use that pot of money to target specific high need areas that need more attention and more focus than the regular program that serves all students. So that's one thought about your suggestion regarding how recapture money might be used. But there's another hidden piece that Bricio, you mentioned, that Cristóbal, I don't know if you got into the unequalized enrichment part of the system, but embedded within the data that TA puts out, you can generate a number called unequalized enrichment, which the state does not equalize. And that applies to the golden pennies portion of the system and 8 cents of the $1.17 that school districts are allowed to tax. So for 8 cents of that system, it is not fully equalized and there is no recapture. So if you're a poor district and you raise a golden penny, the state guarantees that you get $98 for every penny. But if you're a wealthy district and you generate $300 in golden pennies for every 1 cent of tax effort, you get to keep all that $300. And that data is never presented in any of the TA data sets. You actually have to dig it out. And I ran some numbers on the 2021 data, and there were 69 districts that had money that was not recaptured by the state, that was unequalized. And it wound up generating an average of $580 more per student per ADA, or about $400 per weighted student in those top wealthy school districts, by the way, that had about 200,000 students in them. So there is an unequalized component that is still embedded in the Texas school finance system. And to make matters worse, in the last, in HB3, they increased the golden penny amount from 6 pennies to 8 pennies. So instead of having 6 unequalized cents in the system, we had 8 unequalized cents. So they actually made it more unequal than it was when they made that change in the golden penny maximum. And $580 per student can buy you a lot of additional support. And it would be interesting to see among those high wealth districts that you looked at, how much that unequalized enrichment is contributing to the different numbers of students that are taking those advanced courses. And just one last point is that and it is not finance related, but it is critical. The fact that school districts get underfunded across the board, because there's never been a cost study that's actually a valid one that tells you, well, how much money does it take to make sure that every student gets enough support to get into college? Because of the lack of research and therefore the lack of funding. And by the way, the state doesn't want to do the research because if they know, then they might have to do something about it. So there's never been a big push to find out, well, how much does it cost to have kids be college ready? But getting back to the endorsement programs, until we do something about changing the situation where students at the 9th grade level are required in Texas to make a choice of which curriculum track they're going to follow. Are they going to go college prep? Are they going to go career technology? Are they going to go one of the other options? Right now, you know, when that legislation came up, we made the point that freshman students are nowhere, don't have any idea what kind of thing they might want to do when they actually graduate. And to be asking parents and their students to be making those life-changing choices at that level in their education is totally unreasonable. And if we don't address that part of what's wrong with the system, it's going to counter effect. It's going to counterbalance to some extent whatever we might do in terms of increasing equity in the system. Again, just recapping, the system is much more equitable than it was when we first started the fight, but there are still hundreds of dollars of inequity, as you noted, Cristóbal, between the high wealth school districts and the low wealth school districts. And recapture, is one component, but if we put recapture in the golden pennies piece, then the system will be completely equalized. The reason it remains unequalized at that golden penny level is that wealthy school districts were never, ever going to be willing to give up that advantage. And it's going to take continued effort to make sure that we make sure that all of our kids begin on a level playing field, and that when we're competing to go to college, somebody that started at the 30-yard line and our kids that start at the 10-yard line don't wind up, missing out on getting in because they didn't get the same opportunities.
And that I think is critically important. That's really good. And talking about just $500 difference translates in a district of 10,000 students, which is what you see in these affluent districts and enrollment. That $500 translates to $5 million for their 10,000 students.
Yeah,
that's a lot of money.
Yeah,
and that $5 million a year will give you, particularly if it's tied to teachers or resources, that's huge, right? And so I always say, what is the assumption? What are the assumptions that the current school finance data or formula creates? And so the recapture and the reported like revenue per WADA creates this assumption like, see, it's only a few dollar difference. It's not, you know, we're good. What and if it's, and so the problem is because we're fair and equal, it's really these districts that are not making the right decisions, right?
Yeah. They tend to want to pass the buck back down to the school districts that have no control over how much money they get from the state.
Yeah. No, I think that one of the implications for future studies is to then tie down, and we did it at the school level, not just at the district level, these differences in college readiness and equities, and then tie back to particularly these additional golden pennies and comparing the copper pennies if they're, you know, with that difference. That's another direction of implication of study that we should be looking at.
Very good. We have about 18 minutes left, and I do want to leave some time for audience questions. So at this moment, I do want to open it up for audience questions or comments. If you do have a question or a comment, do put your, type it into the chat box. And we have two questions right now. So actually, the first one is a comment by Mr. Dan Sutton, and it says, I worked as a college tutor in the math lab at San Antonio College for 10 years. To me, college readiness means they don't need any developmental or remedial math courses. For those that had done college algebra 2 in high school, it was a bonus, but not generally equivalent to college algebra. At San Antonio College, we had 2 college algebra courses, one for students going no further in math and one for those going on to and through calculus. College algebra was followed by a really strong pre-calculus course and with a lot of trigonometry. College algebra and pre-calculus were my specialties. So this, I think, addresses probably another issue inherent in higher education in Texas, and that's an issue of developmental and remedial maths, which for a very long time have actually served as gateway courses for students that prevented them from moving forward in achieving their college goals. And we're also actually moving away from these gateway courses and thinking of different strategies to advance students through these types of courses and on to completion of their college degree. What comments or thoughts do y'all have on the issue of remedial or developmental courses as they relate to our current topic?
You know, I think there's what I'm fascinated by is there's been some good research that even the Texas Higher Ed Coordinating Board has invested on to kind of show the challenges of how we even qualify students into either remedial courses, but yet has not followed up to implementing some of the recommendations that have come out of these studies that are at this point 10, 15 years old at some point, at some level. So even though we know that there are some challenges with how we look at the area of either that transition point to college and remedial math, I'm always fascinated as to like the failure to respond and why we're not having these better conversations to really create these better transition points and alignments, even using multiple criteria as opposed to just either a particular test score or a particular, even having students come in and do an exam before they enroll in courses, right? If we know anything about even any standardized test or any exam, there's biases that are always going to plague it. And what I'm always fascinated by, even something as simple as looking at high school GPA will actually help us create a better indicator of that. But you know, universities aren't doing anything different to really address that conversation. I think on one hand, you have conversations that universities need to really reflect on and really transform. and not just universities, but even school districts, and how we use still today a test score to essentially decide who gets into what. And that goes from algebra all the way to higher level math in high school. And then obviously we're doing the same thing in college. So that's one conversation. I think policy should help us kind of guide that conversation a lot better and how it's playing out. I don't know if there's an easy solution that kind of tells us, okay, so how do we also improve access at the same time and do so like systemically, right? That specifically in this area of that transition point, so that we, because at the end we have an over enrollment of particularly Latino students, Black students in remedial math, despite what kind of courses they have in high school.
And Cristóbal, that speaks to the quality of math courses that might be available at the high school level in a lot of our high schools, again, because they can't get well-qualified math teachers to teach those courses. But it also, the developmental courses in college are essentially the higher ed response to what K-12 was not able to do right in the first place. And the fact that they even have to have developmental courses in college is a testament to the inadequacies of the K-12 system. And there's a double problem with that. One is that when you take the developmental courses, it'll disproportionately involve students that are coming from underfunded schools that don't offer adequate math preparation. The other problem with this, and I know as a parent you'd be interested in this point, is developmental courses, you have to pay for them just like you do the regular courses, but you don't get any credit for them. So you might wind up taking 2 or 3 developmental courses when you go to a community college. None of those credits transfer over, but you're using up your financial aid eligibility. And in another life, I used to work both in talent search, getting kids into college, and in financial aid and helping kids pay for college. And what happens to students that get tracked into developmental courses because of poor K-12 preparation is they run out of financial aid before the end of their senior year. And so you get a real dilemma there where even if the kids are able to academically adjust and survive and make it all the way up to junior and senior year, if they wind up in too many developmental courses, they run out of money. So that's a really critical issue that needs to be addressed. But I do think, Cristóbal, that if we address the math and English course enrollment and the quality of those courses at K-12, then you won't have any need for developmental courses in community college.
I will add, and I appreciate Amy Getz from the Daney Center, a colleague there, bringing this to mind. And maybe, this idea that students do succeed in college level courses if they're given the right support. I think that's critically important. And what we also know, there's a dominant assumption in the conversation that, students need to be matched, right? And if you put them in more rigorous courses, there's a mismatch, and it's called the mismatch theory. And what we know from research, guess what? Students rise to the occasion, are indeed successful. And what's really more important is access, not whether they are a fit or a test or score or what criteria. And that, I think, is critically important that we acknowledge that, students do rise to the occasion. I had the same conversation for my daughter recently moving to Phoenix or Tempe, where they were trying to use a test score, even though she didn't have a test score for the past 2 years. She had the course GPA for 6th grade, but they wouldn't put her in pre-algebra for whatever assumption and test scores that they were using. And I had to use the same argument. Students rise to the occasion. And that, I think, parents in that conversation become really critical, like making sure that they're arguing for access, making sure they're provided the resources and support. And that carries through college, right? I think that's critically important.
I think.
Go ahead, Luis.
Sorry, the whole idea of the college readiness will be that the kids when they enter college, they do not have to take any of these class remedial courses. And it's very well said by Albert about the fact of the students when they take this, they have to take this college remedial courses. They use up their financial support, or and it's not being counted towards their degree, right? And then what it also does is discourages the students, with like, who wants to be taking this whole semester of 1 or 2 courses that they know that it's not going to be counted and that it's using up their financial support. So it's this whole idea of also being the students being very discouraged. I think also is the reasoning why in high school this type of, we would be asking about this algebra, about the algebra 2, and about the for those students of the calculus that get to have it. It's all about them getting ready for when they enter college and they have to get a higher degree or a higher algebra level. They're ready, and so this is also part of their animo. Again, I go back into this idea of the students gotta feel good, and they gotta be able to feel good about their courses, about their classes as they're moving forward. And students like a challenge. They like to be challenged. And so in the high school, when they're being challenged by putting themselves or placing them at these other levels of courses or classes, we need to be able to provide them with the support, not just put them in a lower class because they can't, or they seem, or the teacher or the counselor thinks that they won't be able to manage. Then it's better to put them in a higher class and then provide the support. But then again, we go back into the school finance. We gotta be able to, or the schools need to have better access to higher funding, so that they can provide qualified teachers, or with higher levels of knowledge, so that they can support the students.
And I'm glad that, Lourdes, that you're on this panel conversation, because these points become really critically important when it comes to partnerships. And Brianda de Leona, our early career scholar over at UTSA, she asked this question: how do we partner with research and stakeholders and community? And a powerful example that I saw out of Montgomery County Public Schools in DC and Maryland, where they had researchers that actually showed specifically how Black and Latino students specifically were not being enrolled in 8th grade algebra. And they used the standardized test score to show to what extent that they were high achieving in the test score, and despite that were not being enrolled. That research came out and the district didn't respond. But then they had a conversation with a Black and Latino coalition of parents and community organizations, had a big convening, and this was in the fall of 2019, brought everybody together and put the district in the center conversation. Within weeks, the district immediately responded that they were immediately going to move Black and Latino students, particularly who had a test score of a certain level, they were able to identify that point, immediately into 8th grade algebra. So even if we produce like the research, it's the partnerships with community and advocates to then have these conversations strategically and say, here's what we know. Here's what even mismatch theory research tells us, that that's not the case. The access is more important. We see that even with dual language learners, Latino students, that they in fact are successful and do rise to the occasion when they have the access to college readiness, but they don't. And that's, Rebecca Callahan's work. How do we do that so that the research is not in isolation? How do we partner strategically with community, particularly to advocate in districts and schools to push these, transformational moments?
Thank you for your comments. I want to remind the audience that even if you're on Facebook Live, you can put your question into the comment section and we'll receive it here. We do have another comments by Ms. Amy Getz. The E3 Alliance and Dana Center have made progress with districts in Central Texas to increase equitable access to 8th grade algebra. Some pretty impressive results. So we do see some collaborations with community-based organizations, with nonprofits, and with institutions of higher education. I guess the question then is how to expand and scale that to the state level. We have about 4 minutes left. I want to go ahead and allow the panelists to provide some closing comments as we wrap up our session here. Whoever would like to start first.
Ladies first.
Gracias. I think this whole idea of the school finance is very, very, very fascinating. It's very interesting. I think as a parent, this is something that we can continue to learn and understand a little bit more, especially when it comes to what it means, with per student, and the difference between also with our districts and compared to other districts. I think it's very, very important that as a community and other organizations, local organizations that work with parents, it's important that we continue with the leadership, with empowerment, and then we, as it was mentioned, that we create these alliances or these collaborations with other entities, that we can work together to support one another, and at the end, be able to support the school districts or the school finance, to be able to make sure that our kids are college ready, and that our kids succeed in their lives. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you, Liz.
Go ahead, por favor.
I think that, the saying that Jose Cárdenas taught me as I was growing up under his tutelage was, "Más sabe el diablo por viejo que por diablo." The devil knows more because he's old rather than because he's a devil. And on a positive note, I think over the 40 some odd years that I worked at IDRA, we always believed that we could change anything in the system if we put in enough time, enough effort, enough research, enough connections with community advocates, that anything is possible. And again, while the funding system needs to be made better, when I started working on the issue, the differences in funding per pupil were thousands of dollars. And the difference in tax effort was 10 cents versus $1 in some school districts. So we've made some significant strides over time, but it does take collective effort. It does take good research. It does take parent advocacy, and it does take sharing that information with all elements of the community, because a lot of times people don't know that the issue is even out there until somebody puts it out on the table and talks about not only what the problem is, but what are some of the options that are available to fix it. I know IDRA historically has been very good at laying this kind of issues on the table, then working with legislators, with researchers, with parent organizations, with educators, both at the K-12 and higher ed level. But it does take that kind of coalition, as you noted, Lourdes. It takes a collective effort, but also a collective will. And I think we all have to consider the fact that those people that have advantages, the advantages they created weren't accidental. They were created by people that wanted the race to be uneven. And so it's up to the rest of us to say, no, mijo. If we're gonna run a race, we're gonna make sure that everybody starts from the same yard line. And I'll leave you with that. And it can be done. We've seen it done. People sometimes didn't like us for it, but then again, we did it for the kids, and that's all that matters.
I'll briefly add, Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1965 on the campus of Howard University, and it's been referenced as the affirmative action speech, but it was so much more than that. He argued this very point that Albert is making. He talked about that, you don't free and make things suddenly presumably equal, and then put everybody in the race and expect them to compete fairly when they've not been given the support, the resource, or the access. And he's essentially telling us, back in the 60s, here's Lyndon Baines Johnson arguing already, like, we need to make sure that all citizens have the equal opportunity and support and resource to compete fairly. And that's not what we're seeing right now, right? So this is an argument that was made essentially 56 years ago. And we're still having this argument of inequity and how the system is unfair. And so I think there's legal precedents. I think there's policy implications we should be pushing, but we can't achieve that in isolation. We have to have that to the points here. We have to be in community. We have to be intentional. We have to build the coalitions across all of our communities. And one, I appreciate that Jose Cárdenas had the vision to put together an organization like IDRA and try to push these efforts together. So I feel this is a real blessing on a number of levels. And again, thank everybody for contributing to this conversation and to continue to move the conversation forward.
Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists, Lourdes Flores, Dr. Cortez, Dr. Rodriguez, Dr. Gonzalez. I want to thank the staff at IDRA that helped organize and plan for this symposium. I want to thank our fearless leader, our president and CEO, Celina Moreno, for her opening comments. And finally, I want to thank all of the participants here today. That concludes our symposium for today, and I wish everybody a wonderful afternoon and a great rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Please stay healthy and strong, everybody.
Thank you very much, Patricio. Lourdes, adios.